I am Lauren, 34 years old, and I just destroyed my husband on our wedding day. Standing in the middle of our Beverly Hills reception, he grabbed the microphone, pulled his weeping mother close, and announced to 200 guests that he was signing all his premarital assets and a massive monthly stipend over to her. He told the crowd that if I could not accept his generosity, I could walk out the door right then and there. The guests wept. They cheered for him. My mother-in-law wiped her fake tears and shot me a triumphant smirk. But I did not cry and I did not leave. I just smiled, took the microphone from his hand, and delivered one single sentence that made the entire room freeze in sheer panic. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who tried to exploit you. The crystal chandeliers of the Beverly Hills Grand Ballroom cast a warm golden glow over the impeccably decorated tables. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne, navigating through a sea of designer suits and expensive evening gowns. I stood near the center of the polished dance floor, in my custom silk dress, surrounded by the scent of fresh white roses and the soft hum of a live string quartet. It looked exactly like the perfect American wedding. My husband Bradley, who managed a supposedly highly successful real estate investment fund, clinked his silver spoon against his crystal glass. He was 35, handsome, in a very calculated and sharp way, and he knew exactly how to work a room of wealthy investors. The elegant chatter died down instantly. Everyone turned their attention to the brightly lit stage. Bradley motioned for his mother Diane to join him up there. Diane was 62, dressed in a ridiculously expensive silver gown that honestly looked much more like a wedding dress than my own simple silk gown. She walked up the carpeted steps, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the part of the overwhelmed emotional mother absolutely perfectly. Bradley wrapped his arm tightly around her shoulders and pulled the microphone close to his mouth. I smiled up at them, playing the part of the adoring bride, but my heart was beating with a slow, steady rhythm of cold anticipation. Bradley cleared his throat, looking out at the massive crowd of investors, friends, and family members. He said, "Lauren and I have been doing a lot of talking about our future, and we have come to an agreement about what family truly means." He paused for dramatic effect, squeezing Diane tighter against his side. He looked down at me, his eyes cold, challenging, and completely devoid of love. "I am transferring all 3 of my premarital estates directly into my mother's name," he declared into the microphone, "and I am establishing a $5,000 monthly stipend for her, straight from my personal accounts." A collective gasp rippled through the massive ballroom. People murmured to one another, some nodding in apparent awe of his incredible generosity. Bradley raised his free hand to quiet them down, his voice taking on a hard, authoritative edge that he usually reserved for his junior employees. He pointed straight at me. "I believe a real man must honor the woman who raised him above all else. If Lauren cannot respect that fact, if she cannot accept that my mother comes first, she can walk out those doors right now." The room went completely dead silent. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall suddenly felt very far away. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy, toxic, and incredibly humiliating. He had planned this public ambush perfectly. He fully expected me to crumble under the pressure to either run away in tears and forfeit the marriage entirely, or bow my head in submissive defeat in front of 200 of his most important social connections. Then the applause started. It began with his groomsmen cheering and clapping from the front table, and soon the entire room was on their feet, praising his unmatched loyalty to his mother. Wealthy women dabbed their eyes, whispering loudly about what a wonderful son he was. Up on the stage, Diane let the lace handkerchief drop slightly from her face. She looked straight down at me and offered a vicious, triumphant smirk that twisted her features. She really thought she had won the ultimate prize. She thought she had successfully secured her son's wealth and put the new subservient wife in her proper place permanently. I stood there perfectly still while the thunderous applause washed over me. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not turn toward the exit. I just maintained a deadpan, calculating smile. Bradley had always told his friends that I was just a plain, boring number cruncher. Whenever I tried to talk about my day at the office, he would roll his eyes, sigh loudly, and say that basic accounting was far too dull for someone operating in the high-stakes world of commercial real estate. He loved the fact that I had an 820 credit score. He loved my flawless income history and my clean background. But he fundamentally underestimated my actual profession. I am a forensic accountant. I specialize in tracking down hidden assets, tracing offshore accounts, and exposing complex corporate fraud for federal investigations. For the past 5 years, my entire career has been dedicated to dismantling financial criminals piece by piece. Bradley genuinely thought I spent my days balancing basic spreadsheets for small businesses. He had absolutely no idea that I spent my working hours dissecting massive tax evasion schemes and analyzing fraudulent money trails for government agencies. As I stood in my expensive wedding dress listening to his arrogant speech and the crowd's misplaced adoration, I mentally reviewed the trap I had already set for him. The trap that was about to snap shut with brutal precision. He was so proud of his little performance, entirely unaware that he had just publicly confessed to a massive federal crime in front of a room full of witnesses. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my silk gown, and started walking slowly and purposefully toward the stage. It was time to show my new husband exactly what a boring accountant could do. As my heels touched the carpeted steps leading up to the stage, the whispers rippled outward like a sudden shockwave. I could physically feel the heavy, judgmental stares of the Beverly Hills elite pressing into my back. Women draped in diamonds leaned across their elaborate floral centerpieces, murmuring behind their manicured hands, eagerly waiting for my public breakdown. They expected tears. They expected me to hike up my expensive silk skirt and run sobbing toward the valet stand, leaving my dignity shattered on the ballroom floor. In their wealthy circles, a woman stripped of financial security was supposed to crumble on the spot. Bradley's groomsmen, a loud collection of trust fund heirs and aggressive day traders, were practically howling with approval from the front table. They clinked their glasses together, spilling expensive champagne over pristine tablecloths, toasting to what they considered the ultimate display of alpha dominance. To them, Bradley had just executed a masterful power play. He had successfully protected his assets, secured his mother's lavish lifestyle, and publicly tamed his new wife in one swift, brutal stroke. He was their absolute, undisputed hero. Bradley stood at the edge of the stage, puffing out his chest, soaking in the validation like a sponge. He looked down at me with a sickeningly arrogant grin, expecting me to beg for his mercy or apologize for a slight I had never committed. Diane played her role to absolute perfection. She dabbed her dry eyes with her lace handkerchief, leaning heavily against her son, as if the sheer emotional weight of his generosity was too much for her to bear. She cast a sidelong, venomous glance at me, her eyes practically gleaming with triumph. The message was loud and clear. She was the queen of this family empire, and I was merely a temporary, disposable addition who had just been forcefully put in my proper place. The guests continued to applaud, a deafening roar of misplaced adoration that filled the cavernous hall. Everyone in that room viewed me as a naive, defeated bride who had been outsmarted by a brilliant strategist, entirely unaware of my true nature. I did not run. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I stopped at the edge of the stage, reached out to a passing waiter who was frozen in shock, and calmly picked up a fresh flute of champagne from his silver tray. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The icy liquid perfectly matched the absolute coldness in my veins. I looked up at Bradley and offered him a brilliant, unwavering smile. His arrogant grin faltered for a fraction of a second. Confusion flashed across his eyes. He wanted panic. He desperately needed my submission to complete his triumphant moment. He expected to see a heartbroken victim standing before him, crushed under the weight of his public humiliation. But I was no longer his victim. I was the executioner, and I was merely watching the clock tick down to zero without hesitation. In my line of work, dealing with corporate fraud, you learn very quickly that criminals always share one fatal flaw. They are blinded by their own arrogance. They believe their schemes are bulletproof, completely convinced that the people around them are too ignorant to see through their web of lies. Bradley was a textbook case of white-collar narcissism. He genuinely believed his performance tonight was a stroke of genius, unaware that the trap closing around him had been designed by the woman he was trying to destroy. My emotional detachment at that moment was absolute. I felt no heartbreak over the death of my marriage, because the man standing on that stage was a complete stranger. The charming, highly supportive partner I thought I had fallen in love with was nothing but a carefully constructed mirage, a predatory illusion designed to secure my clean credit score and my flawless financial background. As I stood there holding my champagne, maintaining my serene composure under the harsh glare of hundreds of judgmental eyes, my mind rapidly reviewed the sequence of events that had brought us to this explosive precipice. The truth is, my marriage had died a swift, brutal death long before I ever put on this white dress. The facade had cracked exactly 3 weeks ago, unraveling a thread of financial deceit so massive and incredibly toxic that it required federal intervention to clean up. It all started when Bradley's mask slipped during what should have been a routine conversation about our future. We were sitting in the living room of our shared apartment, finalizing the last-minute details of the wedding catering, when he suddenly pulled a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase and dropped it onto the coffee table. It was a prenuptial agreement. I had no inherent objection to a prenup. As a financial professional, I actually encouraged protecting individual assets before entering a legal union. But the document Bradley presented was not a standard asset protection agreement. It was an incredibly aggressive, highly irregular contract that raised every single red flag my forensic accounting training had ever taught me to look for. His timing was intentionally manipulative. By springing this document on me weeks before the ceremony, when deposits were paid and invitations were sent, he relied on social pressure to force compliance. He expected me to blindly trust him to sign my name on the dotted line out of pure devotion. He used his smooth-talking charm to convince me the document was merely a boring legal formality required by his investment partners. He assured me it was standard boilerplate language to protect his properties, framing my hesitation as a lack of faith in our relationship. But my job is to follow the money, to analyze the fine print, and to expose the hidden truth buried beneath layers of deceptive legal jargon. When I looked down at those pages, the foundation of our relationship crumbled, setting the stage for the absolute destruction he would face tonight. 3 weeks earlier, the evening air in our downtown penthouse felt unusually suffocating. Bradley had cornered me in the kitchen right after I finished a long day of forensic auditing. He slapped a thick manila envelope onto the marble island, his expensive cologne suddenly clashing with the sterile smell of the freshly printed legal documents. He wore his signature tailored suit, the kind that screamed old money, but I had always known his wealth was a recent flashy phenomenon. I had spent my entire adult life building a quiet, bulletproof financial portfolio. I drove a modest sedan, maximized my retirement accounts, and lived well below my means to ensure I would never be dependent on anyone. Bradley, on the other hand, was a walking billboard for excessive consumption. He leased a new sports car every year, wore watches costing more than a house down payment, and frequently hosted lavish dinners, insisting on picking up the tab. At the time, I thought he was just a highly successful, albeit showy real estate fund manager celebrating his hard-earned victories. I had no idea his extravagant lifestyle was entirely funded by a mountain of toxic debt. "Sign it tonight so my lawyers can file it tomorrow," he demanded, tapping his manicured finger against the envelope. His voice carried an artificial casualness, a strained attempt to make this aggressive ambush seem like standard procedure. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, leaning against the counter to block my exit. His eyes locked onto mine, daring me to challenge him. He framed it as a simple protection of his premarital assets, citing his aggressive real estate ventures. "The partners are insisting on it, Lauren. You know how these corporate guys are. They just want to ensure the fund remains insulated from personal liabilities. It is all completely standard. I slid the documents out of the envelope, the crisp white paper feeling heavy in my hands. Even before I read a single line, my instincts flared. The timing was entirely wrong. A legitimate prenuptial agreement takes months of negotiation, full financial disclosures from both parties, and independent legal counsel. Bradley was demanding a signature on a Friday night, 3 weeks before the ceremony, presenting a unilateral contract drafted entirely by his aggressive legal team. He was banking on my supposed ignorance, assuming my career as a corporate accountant meant I only knew how to balance basic ledgers. He wanted to rush me into signing away my rights before I had the chance to let a qualified attorney dissect the clauses. But I did not need an outside attorney to spot a financial death trap. I simply needed 10 minutes with the paperwork. As my eyes scanned the densely packed paragraphs, the deceptive legalese began to unravel. He had buried a horrifying liability clause deep within the 7th page. The fine print explicitly stated that in the event of a divorce, I would hold zero entitlement to any of his personal assets, properties, or future earnings. That was expected. What made my blood run absolutely cold was the subsequent paragraph. It clearly stipulated that any business debts, regulatory fines, or corporate liabilities incurred during the marriage would be classified as community debt. I would be legally responsible for 50% of his financial failures. He was essentially asking me to become a blind guarantor for his highly leveraged real estate fund, offering me absolutely zero upside while exposing me to catastrophic financial ruin. I looked up from the pages, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Bradley, this states I am liable for your business debts. That is not standard asset protection. That is a direct transfer of liability onto my credit score. His charming facade vanished, replaced by a defensive, volatile anger. He slammed his bourbon glass onto the counter, the amber liquid splashing over the rim. "You are overreacting," he snapped. "It is standard community property language. Do you have any idea how insulting it is that you are interrogating me like a suspect? I am building an empire for us, and you are sitting here analyzing the paperwork like I am trying to rob you. If you do not trust me, Lauren, then what is the point of this wedding?" The gaslighting was textbook. He aggressively twisted the narrative, attempting to make me feel guilty for demonstrating basic financial literacy. He loomed over me, using his physical presence to intimidate me into compliance. It was a classic manipulation tactic designed to exploit emotional vulnerability. A weaker woman might have panicked, terrified of losing the man she loved mere weeks before walking down the aisle. She might have blindly signed her life away just to appease his bruised ego and restore the peace. But I was not a weak woman. I was a professional investigator who spent 40 hours a week untangling the financial deceptions of white-collar criminals. I recognized his manufactured outrage for exactly what it was: a desperate attempt to distract me from the radioactive terms hidden inside that contract. Fighting him directly would only prompt him to find a more covert way to ruin me. To survive this union, I had to play his game, but I had to play it infinitely better. I forced my posture to relax, letting my shoulders drop to simulate submission. I pasted an apologetic look onto my face, projecting the exact image of the naive fiancé he wanted me to be. "You are right," I murmured, keeping my voice gentle and yielding. "I am just stressed with all the wedding planning. I trust you, Bradley. Let me review the signature pages upstairs so I know where to initial." His aggression melted instantly. He offered a victorious smile, believing he had crushed my resistance. "Just bring it down, signed before bed," he instructed. I took the envelope and locked myself inside our bedroom. My compliant facade completely vanished. I laid the contract flat and meticulously photographed every single page with my phone, capturing all the insidious clauses. I carefully placed the documents back into the envelope, smoothed out my expression, and walked back downstairs to hand him the signed contract. He took it with a satisfied smirk, entirely unaware that he had just handed me the exact blueprint of his financial malice. The countdown had officially begun. Exactly 1 week later, with only 14 days left until the ceremony, the reality of the family I was marrying into became even more grotesquely apparent. I was standing on a velvet pedestal inside an exclusive bridal boutique in downtown Los Angeles. The seamstress was meticulously pinning the hem of my silk gown, ensuring the minimalist design draped perfectly across my frame. The boutique was hushed, smelling of lavender and expensive fabric. I was actually enjoying a rare moment of peace, mentally organizing my investigation into Bradley, when the heavy glass doors of the salon were forcefully shoved open. Diane marched into the boutique like a hurricane wrapped in designer labels. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors and carried a massive leather handbag that she swung aggressively, nearly knocking over a display of crystal tiaras. She did not bother greeting the receptionist. She simply spotted me across the room and beelined straight for my pedestal, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The serene atmosphere of the bridal shop shattered instantly. "Lauren," she barked, not even offering a basic hello. She dug her hand into her oversized bag and pulled out a thick embossed piece of paper. She stepped right up to the pedestal and shoved the paper directly into my hands, forcing the seamstress to jump back to avoid being hit. I looked down at the document. It was an invoice from a highly exclusive invite-only haute couture atelier in Beverly Hills. The item listed was a custom hand-beaded silver evening gown. The total amount due at the bottom of the page was $15,000. I stared at the number, then looked back up at Diane, maintaining my perfectly neutral expression. "Is there a reason you are handing me your personal clothing bill, Diane?" I asked calmly. She ripped off her sunglasses and glared at me as if I were incredibly stupid. "You need to clear this balance today," she demanded, her voice echoing loudly enough for the other brides in the shop to hear. "The designer requires payment in full before they will release the dress for final alterations. I expect you to call them right now and put a credit card on file." I handed the invoice right back to her. "If you purchased a dress, you need to pay for it. Or if you expect someone else to fund your wardrobe, you should hand this to your son. I am certainly not paying $15,000 for your mother of the groom outfit." Diane scoffed loudly, a harsh, grating sound that made the boutique manager wince from the front desk. "Bradley does not pay for this sort of thing anymore," she stated with absolute entitlement. "Bradley's money is for my lifestyle, and his capital is tied up in expanding his empire. You have a steady corporate salary and zero expenses. It is your duty as the incoming wife to handle the family incidentals. You are incredibly lucky he is even marrying a plain number cruncher like you. The least you can do is show some basic respect and gratitude to the woman who raised him." Her audacity was almost impressive. She was openly admitting to being a financial parasite, completely comfortable, demanding a massive sum of money from a woman she openly despised. She viewed her son as a personal automated teller machine and viewed me as a secondary funding source to supplement whatever Bradley could not provide. I stepped down from the pedestal, the seamstress scrambling out of the way. I looked Diane directly in the eyes. "Let me make this abundantly clear. I am not a bank, and I am certainly not funding your vanity projects. My income is my own. If you cannot afford a $15,000 dress, I highly suggest you go to a department store and find something within your actual budget." Diane's face turned an ugly shade of mottled red. Her entitlement mutated into explosive rage in a split second. She pointed a manicured finger inches from my face, her voice rising to a shrill screech. "Do not you dare speak to me about budgets, you arrogant little clerk. You have absolutely no idea how this family operates. If you do not pay this invoice by noon today, I will make it my personal mission to ruin your wedding. I will ensure Bradley cancels the entire event. I will make your life a living hell, and I will see to it that my son kicks you out onto the street before you even get a chance to change your last name." She stood there panting, waiting for me to cower. She was used to bullying people into submission through sheer volume and social terror. She expected me to pull out my wallet just to avoid a public scene, but I felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical observation. Her threat to ruin the wedding was an empty one, considering I was already planning to dismantle the entire marriage myself. Her reaction only provided me with more insight into the depths of their financial desperation. If Bradley was truly as wealthy as he claimed, a $15,000 invoice for his mother would not be an issue. The fact that Diane was aggressively shaking down her future daughter-in-law for cash meant Bradley's liquid assets were completely drained. "I will not be paying this, Diane," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, providing a stark contrast to her hysterical screaming. "Now please leave my fitting before I ask the boutique manager to call security and have you escorted out for trespassing." She gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. "You are going to regret this, Lauren. You are going to deeply regret disrespecting me." She snatched the invoice from the pedestal, spun around on her designer heels, and stormed out of the boutique, slamming the glass doors so hard the entire storefront rattled. I stood there taking a slow breath, analyzing the data she had just unwittingly handed me. The financial rot in their family went much deeper than a bad prenuptial agreement. Diane was not just a spoiled mother-in-law. She was a co-conspirator bleeding her son dry. I turned back to the terrified seamstress, offering a polite apology, smoothing down the expensive silk fabric of my gown. Suddenly, a hand gently grasped my bare arm from behind. I spun around. Standing there was Kendra. She was 32 years old, a brilliant African-American tax lawyer, and the woman married to Bradley's younger brother, Connor. Kendra was wearing a sleek, tailored jumpsuit that contrasted sharply with the sea of white tulle and lace surrounding us. She had always been the quiet observer at family dinners, her sharp eyes missing absolutely nothing, while Diane and Bradley held court. She possessed a formidable intellect and a no-nonsense demeanor that I had always quietly respected. Before I could say a word, Kendra placed a finger over her lips, signaling for absolute silence. She grabbed my hand, guided me off the velvet pedestal, and pulled me swiftly into the largest private dressing room at the back of the boutique. She shut the heavy oak door behind us and slid the brass deadbolt into place with a definitive click. The sudden quiet of the dressing room was jarring. Kendra turned to face me, dropping her designer tote bag onto a plush velvet ottoman. She let out a long, exhausted exhale. "I was here for my bridesmaid dress fitting," she explained, keeping her voice low. "I was in the next room when Diane started her screaming match. I figured it was safer to stay hidden until the hurricane passed. You handled her perfectly, by the way. Most women would have completely crumbled under that kind of public humiliation." I appreciated the validation, but my mind was already racing ahead. Kendra was not the type of woman to pull someone into a locked room simply to offer moral support. She operated with extreme precision, much like I did. I looked at her carefully, noting the intense, serious expression on her face. "You did not lock us in here just to compliment my conflict resolution skills, Kendra. What is going on?" Kendra offered a tight, humorless smile. "You are sharp, Lauren. I have always known you were too smart to fall for their act completely." Connor and I have despised the toxic dynamic between Bradley and Diane for years. They parade around like royalty, treating everyone else like disposable peasants. Connor is too loyal to completely cut ties with his brother, but I have absolutely no loyalty to people who operate like financial parasites. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a clear plastic folder. Inside the folder was a piece of paper that looked like it had been violently shredded and then painstakingly taped back together like a jigsaw puzzle. The edges were jagged, and the transparent tape caught the harsh lighting of the dressing room. She held the folder out to me. "I fished this out of Diane's recycling bin yesterday afternoon," Kendra said, her tone dropping into a deadly serious register. "I was dropping off some mail that got sent to our house by mistake. Diane was not home, but her recycling bin had tipped over in the driveway. I saw the bank logo, and my tax lawyer instincts took over. I took the pieces home and spent 3 hours reconstructing it." I took the plastic folder from her hands. My forensic accounting training instantly kicked in, narrowing my focus entirely onto the numbers printed on the reconstructed page. It was a commercial bank statement for one of Bradley's primary real estate investment holding accounts. But the figures did not make any sense. For a fund manager who supposedly controlled tens of millions in liquid assets, the balances were shockingly low. In fact, the account was teetering dangerously close to being overdrawn. "Bradley isn't a millionaire, Lauren," Kendra warned, pointing a manicured finger at the center of the taped page. "He is a mirage. Look at the routing numbers." I traced the columns with my eyes. The statement showed a massive incoming wire transfer from an external investor account. That was standard for a real estate fund. What was absolutely not standard was the immediate corresponding outgoing transfer executed less than 2 hours later. The money was not being held in escrow. It was not being deployed into property acquisitions or legitimate business expenses. The outgoing routing numbers matched a regional bank that I recognized instantly. It was a bank known for servicing small cash-heavy retail businesses. "Where is this money going?" I asked, though my brain was already formulating the terrifying answer. Kendra crossed her arms over her chest. "I ran those routing numbers through a database I have access to at my firm. The receiving accounts belong to a holding company. That holding company owns the leases and operational licenses for Diane's chain of boutique nail salons. Bradley is taking fresh investor capital and immediately funneling it directly into his mother's cash businesses." The sheer audacity of the scheme hit me like a physical blow. This was not just bad business management or poor financial planning. This was textbook money laundering. They were commingling corporate investment funds with retail cash businesses to obscure the origin of the money. Bradley was likely using Diane's salons to wash the stolen investor capital, making it look like legitimate retail revenue, so Diane could maintain her lavish lifestyle and Bradley could hide the missing funds from his partners. "They are layering the deposits," I murmured, my eyes glued to the transaction dates. "He gets an influx of cash from a new investor, skims a massive percentage off the top, and wires it to Diane. She washes it through the salons, pays the taxes on the fake revenue to make it look clean, and they split the profits. It is a closed-loop system." "Exactly," Kendra confirmed, her eyes blazing with professional outrage. "And because you are an accountant with a flawless credit history and zero debt, Bradley sees you as the ultimate life raft. He knows the walls are closing in. He needs a clean cosigner to anchor his sinking ship. If you marry him under state community property laws, your assets and your pristine credit become his shield. He will leverage your financial identity to keep his scam afloat for a few more years." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. The aggressive prenuptial agreement that assigned me 50% of his business debt. Diane's unhinged demand that I pay her $15,000 dress invoice because Bradley's capital was supposedly tied up. They were drowning, and they were actively conspiring to pull me under the water to save themselves. I looked up from the reconstructed bank statement and met Kendra's gaze. We were no longer just future sisters-in-law navigating a difficult family. We were two highly trained financial professionals staring at a massive active federal crime. "We need to map the entire network," I said, my voice completely steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "This single statement proves intent, but we need the master ledgers to prove the execution. If I am going to dismantle him, I need every single transaction he has made for the past 3 years." Kendra smiled, a genuine expression of predatory satisfaction. "I was hoping you would say that. You have access to his home network, and I have access to the tax databases. If we combine our skill sets, we can build a case so airtight that the federal government will have no choice but to annihilate them. But Lauren, we have to move quickly, and we have to be absolutely flawless. If Bradley suspects you know the truth, he will drain your accounts and flee the country before you can even pack a bag." I handed the plastic folder back to Kendra for safekeeping. "Do not worry about Bradley," I replied smoothly. "He thinks I am just a plain, boring number cruncher. I am going to let him keep believing that right up until the moment they put him in handcuffs." We slipped out the back exit of the bridal boutique, bypassing the panicked seamstress and the front desk manager. The lavender-scented air of the salon was instantly replaced by the thick heat of the Los Angeles afternoon. We walked quickly toward the underground parking garage where Kendra had parked. It was a sleek black electric SUV, heavily tinted and virtually soundproof. As the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing us inside the climate-controlled cabin. The reality of our conversation multiplied in gravity. Kendra started the engine, but did not pull out of the space. Instead, she reached into the back seat and retrieved a slim, encrypted laptop. She balanced it on the center console, while I flattened the taped-together bank statement across my knees. The dashboard glow illuminated the jagged edges of the paper, making the astronomical figures printed in black ink look even more sinister. "Let us trace the exact root of this capital," Kendra said, her fingers flying across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Read me the first sequence of outgoing routing numbers from that top transaction block." I leaned closer to the document, tracing the line with my index finger. The incoming wire from the new investor was logged at $2.4 million. Less than 48 hours later, a series of identical transfers began bleeding out of that account. I read the numbers aloud, watching as Kendra typed them into a specialized financial tracking database she used at her tax law firm. The screen flashed as it pulled up the associated holding companies. Kendra tapped the screen, her expression hardening. "Look at this. The primary receiving entity is registered under a generic corporate name, but the operating licenses attached to it are exclusively for retail storefronts." She pulled up the business registration files. "It is Diane's chain of boutique nail salons. Every single one of them." I stared at the screen, letting my professional instincts take over completely. The transfers were not lump sums. They were broken down into highly specific recurring amounts. They were funneling thousands of dollars multiple times a week into accounts tied to cash-heavy retail operations. Nail salons were the perfect front for washing dirty money. The business model relied heavily on cash transactions, making it incredibly easy to inflate daily revenue without raising immediate suspicion from a casual auditor. Diane could claim her salons were booking hundreds of premium manicures a day, creating fake receipts to legitimize the stolen investor capital that Bradley was quietly feeding into her business accounts. The sheer volume of the transfers was staggering. Over the course of just 1 month on this single reconstructed page, Bradley had siphoned nearly $500,000 of fresh investor capital directly into his mother's vanity businesses. Kendra pointed to the timestamps on the transfers, her voice dropping into the clinical, precise tone of a seasoned tax lawyer. "They are layering the deposits," she explained, pulling up a comparative chart. "This is not just bad business. It is money laundering." Bradley takes the raw investor capital, which is the placement phase. Then he initiates the layering phase by fracturing the large sums into these smaller, less conspicuous transfers. He wires them to Diane's salons under the guise of vendor payments or consulting fees. Diane washes the funds by mixing them with her legitimate retail cash flow. Finally, they integrate the clean money back into their personal accounts by claiming it as legal business income. They pay the taxes on it to make the IRS think everything is above board. It is a highly coordinated criminal enterprise. The sterile interior of the SUV felt suddenly suffocating. I leaned back against the leather seat, closing my eyes as the horrifying truth locked into place. The romance, the grand proposals, the lavish dinners, it was all an elaborate, meticulously staged production. Bradley had not chosen me because he loved me. He had not chosen me because of my personality or our shared interests. He had chosen me entirely because of my financial profile. In his world of high-stakes fraud, he was a ticking time bomb, and I was the blast shield he intended to hide behind. I was a senior corporate accountant with zero debt, a flawless credit score, and an impeccable professional reputation. I was the perfect, pristine asset. He needed a clean co-signer to legitimize his fraudulent empire, a financially bulletproof wife who could unknowingly absorb the catastrophic fallout when his Ponzi scheme inevitably collapsed. My marriage was not a romance. It was a calculated financial strategy for Bradley. I looked at the taped document on my lap, feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity replace any lingering shock. Every single argument we ever had about money, every time he aggressively dismissed my career as boring or completely unimportant, it was all carefully designed to keep me blind to his criminal operations. He wanted me docile, blindly trusting, and entirely disconnected from his business affairs. Diane's relentless hostility suddenly made perfect sense. She did not just hate me because she was a jealous mother. She hated me because I was an outsider threatening their closed-loop criminal ecosystem. She deeply resented the absolute fact that her son had to bring a federal accountant into their family just to secure a clean line of credit. They were bleeding other people dry, and they fully intended to drain my entire life savings to cover their tracks. Kendra closed her encrypted laptop, her sharp eyes meeting mine with grim solidarity. We have the motive, and we have the method. Now we just need to secure the digital proof before he ever realizes he is being hunted by us. I nodded slowly, folding the statement carefully between my fingers. He truly thought I was just another naive, submissive bride eager for an extravagant wedding. Instead, he had unwittingly invited a financial predator directly into his fraudulent empire. The hunt was officially underway, and I would not miss my target. I returned to the penthouse just after 10 o'clock that evening, sliding my key into the deadbolt with practiced silence. The sprawling apartment was dark, save for the ambient glow of the skyline pouring through the windows. I slipped off my heels and moved soundlessly down the hallway toward the master suite. The mahogany door was slightly ajar. I peered inside, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. Bradley was sprawled across the king-sized bed, his breathing deep and rhythmic, completely dead to the world after a long day of defrauding his investors. I backed away, pulling the door shut with a soft click, and headed straight for my personal study. I reached into the hidden compartment of my locked cabinet and pulled out my federal-issue highly encrypted laptop. As the machine booted up, displaying its military-grade security protocols, I could not help but laugh at the sheer absurdity of the situation. My professional life was dedicated to tracking down invisible money. For 5 days a week, I sat in a secure facility slicing through shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I decoded complex cryptocurrency transfers for federal task forces and unraveled offshore tax havens. I was trained to break through the most sophisticated cryptographic defenses on the planet to seize stolen assets. Bradley actually thought I spent my days clicking through mundane tax returns and organizing corporate receipts. He had confidently invited an apex predator into his home and handed her the keys to his fragile financial castle. I carried the laptop into his adjacent home office, setting it down gently on his glass desk. The room was a pathetic monument to his fragile ego, filled with framed magazine clippings and meaningless awards he had likely purchased himself. I connected a specialized data extraction cable from my machine directly into his primary desktop tower. The screen flickered to life, presenting a basic login prompt. For a man orchestrating a massive money laundering operation, you would expect a certain level of digital paranoia. You would expect biometric locks, two-factor authentication, or a randomized alphanumeric passcode. But financial criminals like Bradley are universally handicapped by their towering narcissism. I did not even need to run a decryption protocol or hack his keystrokes. I simply typed his capitalized first name followed by his birth year. Bradley 1991. The system unlocked instantly, granting full administrative access to his local network. The stupidity of his security measure was almost offensive. I bypassed his superficial desktop folders, ignoring the sanitized, perfectly balanced spreadsheets he kept visible for casual viewing. Those were the fake numbers, the fabricated reports he handed to external accountants and naive investors to maintain his illusion of wealth. I was looking for the shadow books. I deployed a rapid diagnostic scan across his hard drive, searching for encrypted partitions, masking the stolen capital. Within 90 seconds, my forensic software flagged a concealed password-protected folder buried deep within a mundane system operations directory. He had labeled it with a fake software update title, a pathetic attempt to hide federal financial crimes in plain sight. I ran a custom brute force script against the folder, watching the green code cascade rapidly down my screen. It took less than 2 minutes for the cheap encryption to shatter completely. I opened the directory and hit the absolute motherlode. It was his secondary ledger, the master document containing the unvarnished, horrifying reality of his entire criminal operation. I initiated a secure, untraceable download, mirroring the database, onto my encrypted flash drive to analyze every stolen dollar. As the transfer progress bar crept across my screen, a sudden sharp noise shattered the total silence of the apartment. It was the unmistakable sound of the master bedroom door creaking open. My heart slammed aggressively against my ribs. I instantly dimmed the brightness of my monitor to 0, plunging the office back into pitch darkness. I held my breath, listening intently. Heavy footsteps padded softly against the hardwood floor in the hallway, moving sluggishly toward the kitchen area. Bradley had woken up. If he checked his office, if he saw me sitting at his desk with an extraction cable plugged directly into his hard drive, the entire operation would explode instantly. He would know I had breached his network, and he would have the time and resources to destroy the physical evidence and flee before I alerted authorities. I sat completely frozen in the ergonomic leather chair, my eyes glued to the dark doorway. The sound of running water echoed clearly from the kitchen, followed by the distinct clink of a glass being set down on the marble counter. The data transfer on my laptop was agonizingly slow. 70%, 80%. The heavy footsteps began moving back down the hallway, drawing steadily closer to the office door. I instinctively reached out my fingers, hovering dangerously over the extraction cable, ready to rip it out and risk corrupting the entire file if he took one step inside. The footsteps paused right outside the door. I could hear him breathing heavily in the quiet hallway. The silence stretched tight like a wire about to violently snap. 95%. My pulse hammered deafeningly in my ears, drowning out the ambient hum of the busy city outside. Then he muttered something incoherent under his breath, turned heavily around, and shuffled back into the master bedroom. The door shut with a solid, comforting thud. I exhaled a long, shaky breath, feeling the paralyzing tension slowly drain from my stiff muscles. The download chime sounded softly through my encrypted headphones, 100% complete. I cleanly disconnected the cable, meticulously wiped my digital footprint from his system history, and shut his computer down. I carefully slipped my laptop and the small flash drive back into my secure bag, walking out of his office with the blueprint of his criminal empire securely in my possession. He was sleeping soundly, unaware that his privileged life was officially over. I retreated to my private study, locking the door firmly behind me. I plugged the encrypted flash drive into my isolated terminal and pulled up the extracted master ledger. The raw data populated across my dual monitors in a cascade of numerical betrayal. For the next 3 hours, the silence of the apartment was broken only by the rapid clicking of my mouse as I systematically dismantled my fiancé's entire financial existence. I started by mapping the property acquisition records against county deed registries. Bradley always bragged at dinner parties about flipping commercial high-rises and luxury multifamily complexes. He claimed his portfolio was generating consistent double-digit yields. I pulled the addresses listed in the ledger and ran them through the public property databases. The results were entirely fictitious. The addresses were either empty, worthless dirt lots in the middle of nowhere, or they belonged to shell companies completely unassociated with his primary fund. There was absolutely no legitimate real estate development happening. No construction, no leasing revenue, no property management. The entire operation was a ghost town. So if there was no rental income, how was he paying out the massive quarterly dividends he boasted about to his wealthy friends? I highlighted a specific transaction path following the money from a wealthy retired surgeon who had invested $2 million just last month. The funds hit Bradley's primary holding account, bypassing any standard escrow protocol completely. Within 48 hours, that exact $2 million was fractured into dozens of smaller outbound wire transfers. I cross-referenced the receiving accounts. They belonged to his earliest investors. He was using the surgeon's fresh capital to pay the guaranteed returns to the people who had invested 2 years ago. It was a classic, structurally perfect Ponzi scheme. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul in an endless, desperate cycle of financial cannibalism. The sheer scale of the fraud, was breathtaking. He was juggling over $30 million in phantom equity, constantly hunting for new victims to keep the previous victims satisfied. Without a constant influx of fresh cash, the entire pyramid would inevitably collapse under its own crushing weight. And the ledger showed the cash flow was severely drying up. Investors were getting spooked. The market was shifting. He was running out of wealthy acquaintances to exploit. His operational deficit was expanding exponentially every single quarter, which explained the manic panic behind the money laundering operation with Diane. They were skimming whatever loose cash they could filter through the nail salons before the federal hammer finally fell. I closed the ledger and opened the archived email directory I had scraped from his server. I needed to know exactly how I fit into this catastrophic implosion. I ran a targeted keyword search across his inbox utilizing my name, my credit score, and terms like marriage and cosigner. The search engine delivered a horrifying cluster of hidden communications. The most damning evidence was an extensive email chain between Bradley and a predatory private lending broker dated 8 months ago. That was exactly 2 months before he proposed to me. I opened the thread. Bradley was begging the broker for a short-term bridge loan to cover a massive shortfall in investor payouts. The broker brutally rejected him, citing Bradley's rapidly deteriorating credit history and his grossly over-leveraged assets. The broker clearly stated that no legitimate financial institution would lend him a single dime without a financially pristine guarantor. Bradley's response to that rejection made my stomach turn into ice. He wrote back outlining a strategic acquisition plan. He did not describe a business merger. He described me. He attached a comprehensive background check he had secretly run on my financial profile. He explicitly highlighted my unblemished federal accounting salary, my zero debt ratio, and most importantly, my 820 credit score. I read the exact words he typed to the broker. She is a boring corporate drone, but her financial profile is absolutely bulletproof. I am going to marry her by the end of the year. Once we are legally bound, her pristine credit and her earning power become community property. I can leverage her financial identity to secure the bridge loans and keep the fund afloat. She is too naive and too trusting to ever question the paperwork. I will have her sign a prenup that isolates my supposed assets, but saddles her with joint liability for the business debt. She is the ultimate clean anchor for my credit. The sheer predatory malice of that email was staggering. Every romantic date, every bouquet of roses, every loving gaze he had ever directed at me was a carefully rehearsed performance. He had scouted me like a distressed asset. He had assessed my value, calculated my usefulness, and initiated a hostile takeover disguised as a fairy tale romance. He chose me specifically because he believed my quiet demeanor equated to stupidity. He thought my lack of flashy designer clothes meant I was desperate for his attention. He genuinely believed he could use me as a human shield to absorb the catastrophic blast when the federal government finally audited his fraudulent empire. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen as the skyline outside my window began to lighten with the approaching dawn. There was no grief, no sorrow over a lost future. The man I thought I was marrying had never existed. In his place was a desperate, arrogant criminal who had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy him completely. This revelation fundamentally shifted every single parameter of our upcoming wedding ceremony arrangements. I meticulously saved the emails and the ledgers into a secure, heavily encrypted dossier. Bradley wanted to use my financial identity to anchor his sinking ship. I was going to gladly serve as an anchor, but I was going to tie it directly around his neck and watch him drown in his own monumental, inescapable, devastating, blinding, absolute arrogance. With the master ledger and those predatory emails safely secured on my encrypted drive, I knew I had uncovered the mechanics of his fraud, but understanding how he stole the money was only half the equation. I needed to understand the timeline. White-collar criminals usually operate with a bloated sense of invincibility until external pressure forces them into a corner. Bradley's sudden frantic push for our wedding, combined with the aggressive prenuptial agreement, indicated a man running out of time. I needed to know exactly who was chasing him. I closed his personal files and opened a secure virtual private network connected to my professional federal access portals. In my role as a forensic accountant, I regularly interface with public federal records, financial clearinghouses, and regulatory databases to flag anomalous corporate behavior. I bypassed the standard public search engines and logged directly into the high-tier verification systems used by financial investigators. I entered Bradley's social security number, followed by the employer identification numbers for his primary real estate fund and the various shell companies I had just uncovered. The system processed the query for a few tense seconds before the screen populated with a cascade of severe regulatory alerts. I leaned closer to the monitors, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted but unmistakable federal tracking codes. Bradley was not just struggling with angry investors or private lending brokers. He was actively being hunted by the United States government. The record showed an active, highly escalated audit initiated by the Internal Revenue Service. But this was not a routine examination of mismatched deductions or late filings. The audit had been flagged and escalated to the Criminal Investigation Division. The federal agents had noticed the massive discrepancies between his reported income and his actual cash flow. They had detected the suspicious structured wire transfers bleeding out of his corporate accounts and into Diane's retail businesses. The IRS was already actively tracing the money laundering operation Kendra and I had just mapped out. The audit had been open for 7 months, operating quietly in the background, while federal agents built their case. Bradley knew they were looking into his books. The sudden hiring of aggressive new defense attorneys confirmed he was fully aware of the impending federal crackdown. This explained the manic urgency behind the wedding date. The federal government moves methodically, building an airtight net before they strike. Bradley was racing against a federal clock, desperately trying to secure my pristine financial identity to use as a human shield before the agents knocked on his door. He thought he could outsmart the IRS by burying his toxic debt under the veneer of a legitimate high-earning spouse. I dug deeper into the audit files, cross-referencing the federal tracking numbers with property registry databases. That is when I found the ticking time bomb. Buried under a mountain of pending regulatory actions was a draft for a massive federal tax lien. The IRS had already calculated his preliminary back taxes, fraud penalties, and compounding interest. The total amount owed to the federal government was a staggering $4 million. And the government was not just going to send a politely worded collection letter. They were preparing to slap that $4 million lien directly onto his 3 primary luxury estates. These were the exact same 3 properties he constantly bragged about at dinner parties. The exact same properties he had specifically insulated for himself in that predatory prenuptial agreement. The IRS was preparing to seize everything he owned to satisfy the massive debt. The lien draft was in its final stages of administrative approval. Once the stamp hit the paper, those properties would be frozen, completely unable to be sold, refinanced, or leveraged. Bradley's entire illusion of wealth would evaporate overnight, leaving him exposed to both federal prosecutors and the furious investors he had defrauded. The absolute depravity of his marriage plot finally crystallized in my mind with horrifying clarity. Bradley was acutely aware that the $4 million lien was about to drop. If he remained a single man, the federal government would seize his properties, liquidate his accounts, and leave him utterly destitute before sending him to federal prison. But if he married me before the lien was officially filed, he could trigger a catastrophic loophole in the community property laws. He intended to legally bind us, transforming his impending federal nightmare into our joint marital problem. His plan was brutally simple. He would force me to sign that predatory prenup, legally assigning me 50% of his business liabilities. Then, the moment we said our vows, he would rapidly transfer the deeds of those 3 luxury properties directly into Diane's name. He would claim it was a generous gift to his beloved mother, shielding the physical assets from immediate federal seizure. Meanwhile, the $4 million tax debt would fall squarely onto my shoulders. The IRS would look at my unblemished financial record, my high corporate salary, and my easily garnishable wages, and they would drain my life savings to pay for his crimes. He wanted to leave me financially decimated, chained to a $4 million federal debt, while he and Diane lived comfortably off the stolen investor capital they had successfully laundered through her nail salons. He was literally planning to hand me a financial death sentence as a wedding gift. I stared at the federal lien documents, illuminating my dark office, feeling a profound icy calm wash over me. He thought he was a master manipulator executing a flawless escape plan. He believed he could use the sanctity of marriage to weaponize the tax code against an innocent woman. He had no idea that I knew exactly how to dismantle his entire operation. If I timed my counterstrike perfectly, I could ensure the federal government locked onto him with inescapable precision. I saved the pending lien documents to my encrypted drive, carefully closing the federal portals and wiping my access logs. The wedding was no longer a threat. It was the perfect stage. I was going to let him stand up in front of all his wealthy friends and attempt to execute his fraudulent asset transfer. And then I was going to hand him directly to the federal agents waiting in the wings. I knew the digital paper trail was devastating, but in the realm of federal prosecution, financial ledgers only tell part of the story. They prove the crime occurred, but they do not capture the human malice behind it. If I wanted to ensure Bradley and Diane faced maximum sentencing without any possibility of a plea deal, I needed irrefutable proof of their premeditation. I needed to capture their actual voices openly discussing their intent to ruin me. White-collar criminals are notoriously slippery in court. They often claim ignorance, blame their accountants, or pretend the fraudulent transfers were merely administrative errors. I was not going to leave a single loophole for his high-priced defense attorneys to exploit. The next morning, I drove to a specialized electronics store across town and purchased a military-grade voice-activated audio recorder. It was no larger than a standard flash drive, equipped with dual noise-canceling microphones and a heavy-duty magnetic backing designed specifically to cling to the undercarriage of a vehicle. I waited until midnight to make my move. Bradley was fast asleep in our bedroom, exhausted from a long day of fielding angry calls from his defrauded investors. I slipped quietly out of the penthouse wearing dark clothing and soft-soled shoes, and took the private elevator down to the secure residential parking garage. The cavernous concrete structure was completely silent, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead as I navigated past rows of luxury vehicles. I walked over to his leased sports car, a ridiculous Italian model that cost more per month than most people earned in an entire year. I knelt on the cold concrete floor, ignoring the grease staining my knees, and slid my arm deep under the driver's seat. I felt around the complex wiring harnesses and motorized tracks until my fingers brushed against a solid metal crossbar. I pressed the magnetic recorder firmly against the cold steel, ensuring it was completely hidden from view and securely attached to the frame. The device was programmed to activate the moment it detected human conversation, specifically calibrated to filter out engine noise, radio interference, and road vibrations. Bradley practically lived in his car. He constantly took private business calls while stuck in the notorious Los Angeles traffic, believing the insulated cabin offered total privacy. It was his mobile command center, the one place he felt entirely isolated from scrutiny and secure from prying ears. He had absolutely no idea his private sanctuary was now completely compromised by the woman he planned to destroy. I retreated to the elevator, my pulse remarkably steady and my mind completely clear. I just had to wait for him to hang himself with his own words. The following evening, Bradley told me he was attending a mandatory networking dinner with prospective clients. I knew from the intercepted emails that he was actually meeting with a desperate lending broker trying to secure enough cash to keep his angry investors at bay for a few more days. The moment his car pulled out of the garage, I set my timer. He returned exactly 3 hours later, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and manufactured confidence. He kissed my cheek, complained about the terrible traffic, and headed straight for the shower. I immediately grabbed my keys and went back down to the garage. I reached under the driver's seat, my fingers quickly locating the small magnetic device. I pulled it loose, slipped it into my pocket, and hurried back upstairs to my locked study. I plugged the recorder into my encrypted terminal and loaded the audio files. There were 4 separate recordings. The first 3 were mundane, just Bradley yelling at other drivers and confirming dinner reservations. But the 4th audio file was nearly 20 minutes long. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and pressed play. The unmistakable voice of Diane echoed clearly through the speakers. Bradley had her on speakerphone while navigating the freeway. Diane sounded frantic, her usual arrogant tone replaced by high-pitched anxiety. She was demanding to know if the asset protection documents were finalized. Bradley let out a harsh, cruel laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Relax, Mom." His voice crackled through the audio. "I had her sign the liability clauses last week. She did not even blink. She is so caught up in picking out floral arrangements she has no idea what is coming." Diane sighed heavily into the phone. "Are you absolutely certain the timing will work? The federal notices arrived at my salons today. They are asking about the cash deposits. We are out of time, Bradley. We cannot afford any delays with this wedding." I closed my eyes as Bradley delivered his response, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "I promise you, Mom, everything is perfectly scheduled. Once the ink is dry on the marriage license, her assets are tied to mine. We transfer the toxic properties to your name to dodge the feds and leave Lauren holding the bag. They will seize her corporate accounts to satisfy my debt, and we walk away clean." Diane actually chuckled a wicked, relieved sound. "Good. I cannot stand playing nice with that boring girl anymore. Get the ring on her finger so we can finally be done with this mess." The audio recording clicked off, leaving me sitting in total silence. Any microscopic shred of empathy I might have harbored for Bradley instantly evaporated. Hearing him casually discuss my total financial annihilation with his mother, hearing them laugh at my expense, severed my final ties to humanity regarding their fate. They viewed me as nothing more than a sacrificial lamb to slaughter for their own survival. I unplugged the recorder, my heart beating with the slow, terrifying rhythm of absolute vengeance. The trap was no longer just about self-defense. It was about ensuring they suffered the exact fate they had meticulously planned for me. I smiled coldly and closed the file. The very next morning, I texted Kendra from a secure messaging app. We needed a face-to-face meeting far away from the polished, listening walls of Bradley's social circles. We chose an independent coffee shop tucked into a quiet industrial park on the outskirts of the city, a place where nobody wearing designer labels would ever set foot. I arrived first, claiming a small booth in the back corner facing the entrance. Kendra walked in 10 minutes later, dressed in a sharp beige trench coat, her expression all business. She slid into the booth opposite me, immediately placing her encrypted tablet flat on the scratched wooden table. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I slid my flash drive across the table. "I have the master ledger," I said, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. "And I have audio of Bradley and Diane explicitly outlining their intent to use my credit score to absorb a $4 million federal tax lien while they transfer the remaining assets into her name to dodge the seizure." Kendra's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her professional mask slammed back into place. She plugged the drive into her tablet, loaded the audio file, and inserted a single wireless earbud. I watched her face as she listened to her brother-in-law and mother-in-law laughing about my orchestrated financial ruin. Her jaw clenched tight, a muscle ticking in her cheek. When the recording finished, she pulled the earbud out and tossed it onto the table. "They are absolute monsters," she said, her voice dropping an octave in pure disgust. "Connor has always known his family was selfish, but this is a completely different level of depravity. They are treating you like a disposable corporate entity." I nodded, pulling up the digital ledger files on my own screen. "Look at the outgoing transfers from the past 6 months." I instructed, pointing to the highlighted columns. "He is bleeding his early investors dry, and the surplus is flowing straight into Diane's holding accounts. Now show me what you found on the tax side." Kendra brought up a series of complex tax filings on her tablet. Diane owns 6 boutique nail salons across the county, she explained, tracing the numbers with her pen. On paper, they are incredibly successful. But nail salons are predominantly cash businesses, which makes them the holy grail for money launderers. Diane is taking the stolen investor funds Bradley wires to her, classifying them as daily cash receipts from imaginary customers, and depositing the money straight into her corporate accounts. She pays the federal and state taxes on that fake revenue, which washes the dirty money completely clean. Once the taxes are paid, the money is fully integrated into the legitimate banking system. It looks like honest profit from a booming beauty empire. But I ran a comparative analysis of her reported inventory costs versus her reported revenue. It is mathematically impossible. She claims to be servicing 500 clients a day, but she is only purchasing enough acrylics polish and sanitation supplies to service maybe 50. The margins are completely fabricated. She is reporting massive fake cash revenues to wash Bradley's stolen funds. The scale of their coordinated fraud was breathtaking, and having Kendra confirm the exact mechanics of the laundering operation gave me the final piece of the puzzle. I leaned back against the vinyl booth processing the raw data. They have built an entire criminal ecosystem, I said. Bradley acts as the collection arm defrauding investors under the guise of real estate development, and Diane acts as the cleaning mechanism washing the stolen capital through her salons. And they need me to take the fall when the music finally stops. Kendra leaned forward, her expression turning incredibly urgent. And the music is about to stop very abruptly, Lauren. You need to understand how the Internal Revenue Service operates. The Criminal Investigation Division does not play games. They do not send polite warning letters when they are dealing with multi-million-dollar fraud and money laundering rings. They move fast, and they move with absolute devastating force. The fact that Diane has already received federal notices asking about cash deposits means the agents are in the final stages of their probe. They are crossing their T's and dotting their I's. When the hammer drops, it will be a coordinated raid. They will freeze every single account, seize every property, and arrest anyone tied to the financial network. My blood ran cold at her words. Bradley plans to finalize the asset transfer the moment we sign the marriage license, I said. He wants to execute a quitclaim deed to put the properties in Diane's name, leaving me legally shackled to his remaining liabilities as his spouse. Kendra shook her head emphatically. We cannot let that happen. We need to ensure you are completely insulated legally before the federal agents make their move. If you sign a legitimate marriage license, you step directly into the blast radius. Community property laws in this state are ruthless. The government will not care that you were deceived. If your name is on the marriage certificate, your assets are fair game for debt collection. You will lose your retirement accounts, your savings, and your professional license. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in the reality of the situation. I am not going to let him file the marriage license, I stated with absolute certainty. I have a plan for the ceremony, but Bradley is already pressuring me to sign preliminary paperwork. He wants an asset transfer consent form signed this week. He claims it is a standard business formality for his fund, but I know it is the legal mechanism he needs to push the properties to Diane the second we say our vows. Kendra's eyes gleamed with a brilliant tactical light. Then you are going to sign it, she said smoothly. But you are going to sign a document that is fundamentally legally defective. You have to play the role of the compliant, naive bride right up until the very last second. If he hands you a corporate consent form, we will alter the notary stamp and the signature line just enough to render the contract completely void in a federal court, but not enough for Bradley to notice at a casual glance. He is too arrogant to scrutinize a document he believes he forced you into signing. We spent the next hour in that quiet coffee shop drafting a meticulous countermeasure strategy. We analyzed the specific legal requirements for property transfer consent forms, identifying the exact structural weaknesses we could exploit. Kendra outlined the specific notary discrepancies that would automatically invalidate a corporate asset transfer without raising immediate alarms for the recipient. I absorbed every detail, committing the legal loopholes to memory. We were no longer just reacting to Bradley's betrayal. We were actively building the legal cage that would trap him. By the time we walked out of the coffee shop and into the bright morning sunlight, our alliance was unbreakable. I had the forensic evidence, and Kendra had the tax law expertise. Together, we were going to hand the federal government a perfectly packaged criminal indictment, and we were going to make sure Bradley and Diane took the fall entirely alone, locked away in a federal prison cell where their arrogant manipulation could never harm another innocent victim again. 2 days later, the scenario Kendra and I anticipated played out with terrifying predictability. I walked into our penthouse after a late meeting, dropping my keys into the silver bowl. Bradley was waiting in the kitchen. Usually glued to his phone barking orders tonight, his phone lay face down on the counter. He had poured 2 glasses of vintage red wine and arranged an artisanal cheese platter. The performance was meticulously crafted. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with sleeves casually rolled up, projecting the image of a relaxed fund manager. But my trained eyes caught the micro expressions of sheer panic. The tight clench of his jaw, the subtle tapping of his left foot. A faint sheen of perspiration gathered at his temples despite the air conditioning. He was a cornered animal acting like a predator. "Lauren, darling," he purred, sliding a wineglass toward me. "I am glad you are home. Take a sip and relax. We have a tiny bit of boring administrative housekeeping to handle before we can focus on the wedding this weekend." I took the glass, faking a look of bright adoration. "Oh, really?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Did the caterer mess up the invoice? Or is this about the seating chart? Because if your mother tries to move my friends again, I might scream." He forced a hollow laugh, wrapping his arm around my waist. "Nothing like that," he murmured, kissing my head. "It is just internal corporate restructuring. My board of directors is executing a routine portfolio realignment before the fiscal quarter ends. Because we are getting married in a few days, compliance needs you to sign an asset transfer consent form. It simply states you acknowledge my premarital properties are moving into a holding trust. It is a standard business formality." He slid a thick document toward me, capping it with a gold fountain pen. The title was Asset Transfer Consent and Marital Liability Waiver. The audacity of his lie was staggering. There was no board of directors or routine realignment. He was aggressively setting up the mechanism required to dump his toxic, highly leveraged real estate properties directly into Diane's lap the absolute second we said our vows. He needed my signature to waive my right to contest the transfer, locking the federal tax lien onto my clean financial identity while they escaped. He pressed the cold gold pen into my hand. "Just sign right there at the bottom and we can get back to celebrating our future," he coaxed. I looked down at the signature line, maintaining my flawless mask of compliant ignorance. "Oh, Bradley, this looks so complicated." I sighed, letting my shoulders slump. "Do I really need to read all this legal jargon? I have a massive headache from staring at spreadsheets all day, and I still need to finalize the floral delivery schedule. Can we do this tomorrow?" His grip on my waist tightened, genuine aggression breaking through his charming facade. "It needs to be filed first thing tomorrow morning, Lauren. Do not make a big deal out of a simple signature. It takes 2 seconds and then I handle the rest. You do not need to worry about corporate details. I have everything under control." I suppressed a violent surge of revulsion, forcing an agreeable nod. "Okay, fine," I chirped. "But I need to stamp this with a notary seal, right? I see a notary block at the bottom. Let me just run into my home office and grab my professional stamp. I will be right back." He let out a heavy sigh of relief, dropping his arm. "Make it quick," he instructed, reaching for his wineglass to celebrate his perceived victory. I walked down the hallway and slipped into my locked study. Once the door shut, my submissive demeanor vanished entirely. I walked over to my secure desk drawer and pulled out a small, self-inking notary stamp. I acquired this specific stamp earlier today from a trusted colleague at my federal accounting firm. My colleague retired his notary commission over 3 years ago. The stamp I held in my hand was completely legally expired. In the eyes of the United States federal court system, any legally binding contract executed with this specific seal is automatically rendered null and void. I carried the document and expired stamp back to the kitchen. Bradley was leaning against the counter, scrolling rapidly through his phone. I set the paper down, uncapped his gold fountain pen, and signed the consent form. But I did not use my legal signature. My federally registered legal name is Lauren Elizabeth Carter. I deliberately omitted my middle name and subtly altered the cursive stroke of my last name, signing it as Lauren E. Cartner. To a desperate criminal rushing through a fraudulent transaction, it looked perfectly legitimate. But to a federal judge scrutinizing a contested asset transfer, the signature was an undeniable, provable mismatch. I firmly pressed the expired notary stamp over the signature block, leaving a crisp, dark ink impression that officially sealed his spectacular failure. I slid the document across the counter. There you go, all done. I smiled brightly. Can we go back to talking about the honeymoon now? Bradley snatched the paper with lightning speed. He barely glanced at the signature line. He did not check the expiration date on the notary seal. He simply saw ink on the page and assumed he successfully chained me to his sinking ship. He tucked the voided contract into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut. You are the best, Lauren. He grinned, raising his wine glass in a triumphant toast. This changes everything for us. I picked up my own crystal glass, staring right through his incredibly deceitful eyes. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red wine, thoroughly enjoying the absolute certainty of his impending catastrophic destruction. You have no idea, Bradley, I replied softly. You really have absolutely no idea. The transition to the rehearsal dinner the following evening was seamless in its hostility. We were seated in the private dining room of an exclusive country club. The tables were draped in heavy linen and weighed down by extravagant floral centerpieces Bradley financed with stolen funds. The room was packed with his associates, extended family, and aggressive groomsmen who would soon cheer for my demise. I sat quietly at the head table, picking at seared scallops, wearing a polite smile that masked my total revulsion. Diane stood up, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The room quieted, turning to the matriarch of this fraudulent empire. She wore a glittering emerald gown, her neck heavy with diamonds belonging to defrauded retirees. She beamed, raising her glass. I want to propose a toast to my son, Diane announced. Bradley has always been a visionary. He built a magnificent real estate empire from the ground up, and he has always taken care of his family first. And now he is taking care of Lauren. She turned her gaze directly toward me. Her smile remained, but her eyes were venomous. Let us be honest, Lauren. You are a lucky woman. You spend your days crunching numbers in a cubicle, living a modest life. But tomorrow my son is elevating you. He is bringing you into a world of true wealth. It is an adjustment for your background, but we know you will be grateful for everything Bradley is providing. To Bradley sharing his success with those less fortunate. The guests chuckled politely, raising their glasses. A few of Bradley's friends shot me pitying glances. Diane had publicly branded me a desperate charity case, a plain corporate drone rescued from mediocrity by her wealthy son. Bradley grinned, kissing his mother's cheek and accepting the applause. He basked in the narrative that he was my financial savior. I raised my glass and took a sip of water. I let Diane enjoy her joke. Tomorrow she would be desperately begging federal agents to keep those stolen earrings. The rehearsal dinner wound down, and Bradley and I returned to our hotel suite. The facade of the generous groom vanished the second the heavy door shut. He loosened his tie, ran a hand through his hair, and immediately marched over to his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents and dropped them onto the glass coffee table. Lauren, I need you to sign these vendor releases right now, he said, rubbing his temples to simulate exhaustion. The florist and catering company are demanding final liability waivers before they set up the ballroom tomorrow morning. My legal team just messaged me. It is a massive headache, but I just need your signature on the bottom line so I can authorize the final wire transfers. I walked over to the coffee table, playing the part of the drained bride. I picked up the stack of papers. The first 2 pages were standard liability waivers from the hotel catering staff, but my thumb caught the edge of the 3rd page. It was slightly thicker stock paper. I slid it out a fraction of an inch, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. It was a general power of attorney. Bradley was not just trying to saddle me with his business debts through a fake prenuptial agreement. He was going for total financial annihilation. A general power of attorney would grant him unilateral legal access to my personal bank accounts, my retirement funds, and my professional federal identity. He could drain my life savings and take out massive lines of credit in my name without my consent. He wanted to strip mine my financial existence the moment the federal agents froze his accounts. I did not gasp. I did not confront him. I simply sighed loudly, rubbing my eyes. Bradley, my hands are cramping from writing thank you notes all day, I complained softly. Can we really not do this tomorrow? He stepped closer, his physical presence looming over me. Lauren signed the papers. We are getting married in 12 hours. I am handling the stressful parts so you can just enjoy the day. Do not make this difficult. I nodded submissively. You are right. I am sorry. I just want everything to be perfect. Let me grab my pen. I turned my back to him and walked to my designer purse. I reached inside and retrieved a sleek silver fountain pen. It looked like an expensive gift, but it was a specialized tool I acquired during a federal fraud prevention seminar in Washington. The ink cartridge inside was filled with an advanced chemically engineered vanishing ink. When applied to paper, it looked dark permanent and completely legitimate. But within 4 hours of exposure to ambient air and room temperature, the chemical composition degraded. The ink evaporated entirely, leaving zero trace, not even an indentation on the paper. I walked back to the coffee table, uncapped the heavy silver pen, and flipped through the stack of documents. I scrawled my full legal signature across the 2 catering waivers, and then without any hesitation, I signed my name directly onto the signature block of the general power of attorney. The dark blue ink bled into the thick paper, looking undeniably permanent. Bradley snatched the stack of papers off the table the second my pen lifted from the final page. He let out a long, heavy exhale, a predatory smile creeping across his face. Thank you, darling. I will give these to my lawyer first thing in the morning. Now go get your beauty sleep. You have a big day ahead of you tomorrow. I smiled back at him, slipping the silver pen into my pocket. He walked away, clutching a document that would erase itself long before the sun even came up. He thought he had successfully secured the keys to my entire financial life. He had no idea he was holding a blank piece of paper. The morning of the wedding arrived with a frantic knock on my hotel suite door. The sunlight felt almost mocking, illuminating a day built entirely on deception. The bridal suite filled with a chaotic whirlwind of stylists rushing around. I sat perfectly still, letting the makeup artist paint my lips a soft rose. I projected the exact image of a serene bride, but my mind was laser-focused on the final, most critical vulnerability of my operation: the physical marriage license. To execute the ultimate trap without destroying my financial future, I needed an accomplice on the inside of the ceremony itself. I needed the person holding the legal power to bind us. That person was Tara. We met during our freshman year of college, surviving grueling accounting exams and terrible breakups together. When Bradley proposed, I immediately asked Tara to get ordained online to officiate the ceremony. Bradley agreed, viewing it as a quirky touch that would save him money. He vastly underestimated the bond between women who had navigated a decade of life together. I waited until the stylist moved on, slipped out of the noisy suite, and navigated the quiet corridors toward the private garden courtyard where the ceremony would take place. I found Tara standing under the massive floral archway. She was wearing a sleek charcoal pantsuit, reviewing her binder of vows. She looked up and smiled brightly when she saw me approaching, stepping down from the elevated altar to pull me into a tight hug. She pulled back, studying my face with sharp intuition. You look beautiful, Lauren, but you also look like you are preparing for a deposition rather than a wedding. What is going on? Her instincts were flawless. I glanced around the courtyard, ensuring the catering staff were out of earshot. I grabbed Tara by the arm and pulled her behind a thick wall of white hydrangeas, shielding us entirely from public view. Tara, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I said, keeping my voice low and urgent. I am going to tell you something that sounds completely insane, but I need you to trust me implicitly. The man I am supposedly marrying in 3 hours is a federal criminal. He is currently under active investigation by the Internal Revenue Service for running a massive Ponzi scheme, and he is attempting to use this marriage to make me legally liable for $4 million in federal tax debt. Tara stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. The binder of wedding vows slipped slightly in her grip. For a second, I thought she might demand to call the police. But Tara is an auditor for a major corporate firm. Her analytical brain kicked in faster than her panic. She gripped my shoulders, her expression hardening into absolute steel. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do," she whispered. I pulled the official county marriage license from my pocket. It was crisp white and completely blank. In the state of California, a marriage is not legally binding the moment you say your vows or exchange rings. It only becomes a recognized legal union when the ordained officiant signs this specific piece of paper and physically files it with the county clerk recorder office. Until that document is processed by the state government, a wedding is nothing more than an incredibly expensive, highly decorated theater performance. I handed the blank license to Tara. "I need you to conduct the ceremony exactly as we rehearsed," I instructed, holding her gaze with unwavering intensity. "You will walk down the aisle. You will read the beautiful speeches, and you will pronounce us husband and wife in front of 200 guests. But you will not, under any circumstances, sign this piece of paper, and you will absolutely not file it with the county clerk. I need you to take this document and destroy it the second you get home." Tara looked down at the pristine legal document, then back up at me, a fierce, predatory smile slowly spreading across her face. "So I am officiating a play," she confirmed, her tone turning entirely professional. "A complete theatrical production to keep him comfortable while the trap closes. You will not be legally married today." "Exactly," I replied. "Bradley thinks he has already won. He thinks he forced me into a predatory prenuptial agreement, and he thinks he tricked me into signing a power of attorney last night. What he does not know is that I voided the asset transfer with an expired notary stamp, and I signed his power of attorney with vanishing ink. He holds zero legal power over me. But to execute his fraudulent asset transfer to his mother, he needs to believe the marriage is valid. I need him standing on that stage tonight, arrogant and exposed, publicly claiming his mother's new wealth. That is the exact moment the federal agents need to secure the raid. If this license gets filed, I am legally tethered to a sinking ship. If you destroy it, I remain a single, completely insulated woman watching a criminal burn." Tara folded the marriage license meticulously and slid it deep into the inside pocket of her tailored suit jacket. She patted the pocket flat, her eyes burning with fierce loyalty. "The document does not exist, Lauren. You will walk down that aisle a single woman, and you will walk out of this reception a single woman. Bradley is going to get the show of a lifetime." I exhaled a deep breath, the final puzzle piece locking firmly into place. The loophole was secured. The escape route was paved in concrete. I hugged Tara tightly, feeling the overwhelming relief of having an unbreakable ally in the middle of a war zone. I turned and walked back toward the bridal suite, ready to slip into my white gown. The stage was set, the audience was taking their seats, and the curtain was about to rise on Bradley's final performance. The orchestral music swelled as the heavy mahogany doors swung open. I walked down the pristine white runner, the heavy silk of my gown brushing against imported orchids lining the aisle. Every eye in the garden courtyard was fixed on me, admiring the illusion of a perfect Beverly Hills bride. At the end of the aisle stood Bradley, looking devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo. He wore a practiced expression of profound devotion, looking like a man eagerly awaiting his forever partner, not a financial predator watching his human shield arrive. Diane sat in the front row, dabbing her dry eyes. I reached the altar and handed my bouquet to Kendra. Tara stood before us, holding her binder, projecting the solemn authority of an ordained minister. When it came time for the vows, Bradley went first. He projected his voice perfectly, ensuring the wealthy investors in the back rows could hear his masterful performance. "Lauren," he began, his voice dripping with manipulative charm, From the moment I met you, I knew you were the anchor I needed. You bring stability to my chaos. I promise to protect you, to share everything I have built with you, and to lead our family into an empire of prosperity. Several guests sniffled deeply, moved by his hollow promises. I heard a criminal confirming his intent to legally tether my immaculate credit to his collapsing scheme. He squeezed my hand, smiling brilliantly for the photographer. I smiled back, feeling nothing but cold anticipation. It was my turn. The garden fell completely silent, the afternoon breeze rustling the floral archway above us. I looked directly into his deceitful eyes. "Bradley," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and serene. "You have shown me exactly who you are, and you have taught me the true value of an airtight contract. I promise to hold you entirely accountable for every single thing you bring into this union. I vow to stand by and watch you reap the absolute fullest rewards of your own actions. I will ensure your legacy is permanently recorded, and I promise to give you exactly what you have earned. I will never let you escape the consequences of the bond we forge right here today." The guests smiled warmly, wiping away tears. They interpreted my words as a fierce, unwavering declaration of spousal loyalty. Diane nodded in smug approval, completely mistaking my vow of accountability for submissive devotion. Only Kendra, standing a few feet away, caught the lethal double meaning hidden in my vows. I saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward in silent appreciation. Bradley chuckled softly, squeezing my fingers again, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just publicly sworn to oversee his federal prosecution. Tara instructed us to exchange rings. He slid a heavy diamond onto my finger, and I slid a gold band onto his. Then Tara smiled brightly at the crowd. "By the power vested in me by the state of California, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Bradley pulled me in and kissed me enthusiastically. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. The moment we exited the courtyard, the wedding planner swiftly directed us into an ornate private holding room to sign the legal paperwork, while the guests transitioned to the grand ballroom for cocktail hour. Tara followed closely behind us. A waiter stood in the corner of the holding room, holding a silver tray with two tall flutes of vintage champagne. Bradley immediately grabbed a glass, downing half of it in one triumphant gulp. He practically radiated arrogant satisfaction. Tara pulled a generic marital certificate from her binder and placed it onto the polished oak table. It was a ceremonial keepsake document, an utterly meaningless piece of paper that couples often frame. It carried zero legal weight in California, but to a distracted criminal, it looked official enough. I needed to ensure even this fake document was ruined, preventing him from ever trying to use it as circumstantial proof of our union. I picked up the second flute of champagne and walked over to the table. Bradley pulled his expensive fountain pen from his pocket. "Lauren, come sign this so we can go join the party," he ordered. "The investors are waiting and I need to make rounds." I stepped right beside him, holding my champagne flute precariously close to the crisp paper. I gave Tara a swift, barely noticeable nod. She bumped my elbow. I gasped intentionally, losing my grip on the crystal glass. The entire flute tipped over, sending a tidal wave of sticky, bubbling champagne cascading directly across the certificate, turning the entire document into a soggy, unsalvageable mess. "Oh no!" I cried, bringing my hands to my mouth in an exaggerated display of horror. "I am so incredibly clumsy today. I completely ruined the certificate. I am so sorry, Bradley." I grabbed a cloth napkin and frantically dabbed at the soaked paper, smearing the ink into an illegible gray smudge. Bradley let out a sharp sigh. Tara quickly stepped in, playing her role flawlessly. "Do not worry about it, you two," she reassured him, with a bright, professional smile. "That was just the decorative keepsake copy anyway. The county clerk's office is closed for the weekend. I will print a fresh legal copy on Monday morning, bring it by your apartment for you both to sign, and file it myself. Go enjoy your reception." Bradley simply waved his hand, completely unconcerned with the temporary administrative delay. He believed the predatory prenuptial agreement and fake power of attorney already bound me to his ruin. "Whatever, just handle it on Monday," he instructed Tara, tossing his pen into his pocket. He turned to me, his charming facade snapping into place. "Come on, darling. Let us greet our guests. We have a massive future to celebrate." He grabbed my hand and pulled me out the door. The illusion of our matrimony was perfectly executed. I took a deep breath and walked forward. Bradley paraded me into the lavish grand ballroom where the cocktail hour was already roaring. Crystal glasses, clinked jazz music echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and waiters circulated with expensive appetizers. The moment we crossed the threshold, Bradley immediately dropped my hand. His performance as the devoted groom instantly evaporated as he spotted a group of high-net-worth individuals standing near the intricate ice sculpture. He needed to schmooze to pour drinks and to secure his alibis. He needed to keep his sinking Ponzi scheme afloat for just a few more days. I smiled graciously, touching his arm, and told him I needed to run to the bridal suite to pin up my train and freshen my makeup. He waved me off without even looking at my face, already aggressively pitching a fake commercial property development to a retired surgeon. I slipped away from the crowded ballroom, moving silently down the long carpeted hallway. The laughter and heavy bass of the reception faded into a dull murmur. I reached the master bridal suite, stepped inside, and pushed the heavy oak door shut. I turned the brass deadbolt and slid the security chain firmly into place. Total silence enveloped the room. I was entirely alone. I tossed my heavy lace veil onto a velvet armchair and walked straight to my leather overnight bag, tucked deep inside the wardrobe. I unzipped the bag and pressed my fingers against the false bottom, pulling back the hidden lining to retrieve my Federal Issue highly encrypted laptop. I carried the sleek metal machine to the brightly lit vanity table, pushing aside discarded makeup brushes and empty perfume bottles to make room. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The system booted up instantly, illuminating my face with a harsh blue glow. I bypassed the standard commercial internet browsers and immediately launched a secure Tor connection. The specialized software encrypted my digital footprint, routing my signal through dozens of randomized global relays. I was completely invisible, operating as an untraceable ghost within the network. I navigated directly to the secure intake portal for the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office, simultaneously opening a secondary encrypted window for the local Federal Bureau of Investigation white-collar crime field office. I opened my heavily protected master folder and began uploading the payload. It was a comprehensive 200-page digital dossier meticulously outlining the entire anatomy of Bradley and Diane's criminal syndicate. I attached the reconstructed bank statements Kendra had painstakingly verified, clearly highlighting the structured illicit cash flows. I uploaded the offshore routing numbers, the fabricated property deeds, and the terrifyingly accurate tax analysis, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Diane's boutique nail salons were nothing more than aggressive money laundering fronts. Then I attached the ultimate kill shot. I uploaded the crisp high-definition audio files of Bradley and Diane openly laughing about my orchestrated financial destruction. The federal agents would hear their exact voices completely unvarnished, explicitly discussing their intent to defraud the government and saddle me with a massive federal tax lien. In the encrypted text box provided for anonymous tips, I typed a precise clinical summary of the imminent threat. I detailed Bradley's extreme flight risk, noting his access to liquid cash and his frantic attempts to secure bridge loans from predatory private lenders. I provided the exact addresses of the 3 luxury properties currently targeted by the pending $4 million federal tax lien. I explicitly warned the agencies that the target was attempting to execute a fraudulent asset transfer to his mother Diane under the guise of a wedding celebration this very evening. I explained that the target believed he had successfully secured a community property shield, making him highly vulnerable and completely unaware of impending federal action. I urged immediate coordinated intervention to prevent the catastrophic loss of recoverable assets and to secure the location before the suspects could destroy any physical evidence hidden within the venue. I reviewed the uploaded files one final time, ensuring every single digital document was perfectly legible and properly categorized for the federal prosecutors. The financial data was flawless. The legal arguments were absolutely bulletproof. The evidence of premeditated malicious fraud was overwhelmingly vast. I moved my cursor over the bright blue submit button on the screen. There was no hesitation in my mind, no lingering doubt in my heart, and absolutely no remorse for the man currently drinking expensive champagne in the ballroom below. I pressed down firmly on the trackpad. The green progress bar surged across my screen, transmitting the encrypted data packets directly to the secure federal servers located across the country. Within seconds, a stark white confirmation code flashed brightly on the monitor. The submission was successfully received and officially logged into the federal law enforcement database. The digital match had been dropped directly onto his highly flammable, deeply corrupt empire. I securely wiped the browser history, executed a specialized program to scrub the temporary memory cache, initiated a rapid shutdown sequence, and slipped the heavy laptop back into the hidden compartment of my overnight bag. I zipped it closed effectively, concealing the powerful digital weapon that had just permanently ended Bradley's entire privileged existence. I walked back over to the vanity mirror and critically examined my reflection. I looked exactly like a radiant, blissfully ignorant bride preparing for the best night of her life. I smoothed down the expensive silk fabric of my gown, picked up a tube of bold red lipstick, and applied a fresh, flawless coat to my lips. I locked my serene composure firmly into place, transforming myself back into the ultimate Trojan horse. I unhooked the brass security chain, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and stepped out of the silent bridal suite. I walked purposefully back down the carpeted hallway, completely ready to rejoin the lavish wedding reception, take my seat at the head table, and watch the spectacular fireworks display I had just ignited. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped back into the grand ballroom. The transition from the quiet, isolated hallway to the deafening roar of the reception was jarring, but I let the vibrant energy wash over me. The air was thick with the rich scent of roasted filet mignon, expensive designer perfume, and hundreds of fresh white roses. Waiters glided effortlessly between the round tables, refilling crystal goblets with premium vintage champagne. I navigated through the sea of wealthy guests, offering polite smiles to Bradley's aggressive business partners and nodding graciously at his distant relatives. I took my assigned seat at the center of the lavishly decorated head table. Bradley was already there, his face flushed with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. He leaned over, kissed my cheek with cold lips, and whispered that he had a special surprise planned for his mother. I simply smiled, resting my hands neatly on my lap, fully aware of the digital bomb currently detonating inside the federal law enforcement databases. The string quartet finished playing a soft classical piece, and a sudden, expectant hush fell over the room as Bradley abruptly stood up. He grabbed a microphone from the podium, tapping it twice to ensure it was active. The sharp thuds echoed through the massive ballroom, demanding absolute attention from every single person present. He gestured for Diane to join him on the elevated stage. She practically glided up the carpeted steps, wearing her custom silver gown, playing the role of the humble, devoted matriarch with nauseating perfection. Bradley wrapped a strong, protective arm around her shoulders, pulling her incredibly close to his side. He looked out over the crowd of 200 guests, his chest puffed out, radiating an overwhelming aura of absolute authority and unearned pride. "Lauren and I have been doing a great deal of talking about our future," Bradley announced, his voice booming through the sophisticated sound system. "We have come to a beautiful agreement about what family truly means." He paused, letting the heavy silence stretch, squeezing his mother tighter. He looked directly down at me, his eyes turning hard and completely devoid of any affection. "I am officially transferring all 3 of my premarital estates directly into my mother's name," he declared loudly. "And I am establishing a $5,000 monthly stipend for her straight from my personal accounts." A collective gasp rippled rapidly through the room. Bradley raised his free hand to silence the shocked murmurs, his tone shifting into a sharp, aggressive command. "A real man honors the woman who raised him. If Lauren cannot respect that fact, if she cannot accept that my mother comes first, she can walk out those doors right now. The massive ballroom plunged into a deafening, suffocating silence. The air grew instantly heavy, thick with the crushing weight of his brutal public ultimatum. 200 pairs of eyes shifted from the stage and locked directly onto me. The wealthy investors seated at the front tables stared with unblinking curiosity, waiting to see exactly how the new bride would handle this severe humiliation. At the far side of the room, Bradley's groomsmen exchanged smug, highly satisfied glances. They leaned back in their chairs, clearly enjoying what they perceived as a masterful display of patriarchal dominance. They expected me to shatter instantly. They anticipated a hysterical breakdown, fully believing I would either dissolve into pathetic tears or run sprinting out of the venue in absolute disgrace. Up on the stage, Diane shifted her weight. She pulled away from Bradley just enough to lean her face toward the microphone he was holding tightly. The fake tears she had been wiping away moments earlier completely vanished without a trace. Her expression morphed into a sharp, venomous sneer. She looked down at me from her elevated position, her eyes gleaming with undisguised malice and absolute triumph. "Well," Diane purred into the microphone, her voice echoing sharply across the silent room. "What is it going to be, Lauren? Are you going to be a supportive wife or a selfish little girl?" The sheer audacity of her taunt hung in the stale air. She thought she had me entirely trapped in a flawless scheme. She genuinely believed her son had successfully isolated me, legally bound me to his collapsing financial empire, and publicly stripped me of my dignity. She thought I was paralyzed by the immense social pressure of the Beverly Hills elite staring me down, but I felt absolutely no fear, no humiliation, and zero panic. The trap she thought she had sprung on me was nothing more than the final stage of my own meticulous execution plan. I caught Kendra's eye across the room. She was sitting at her table holding her wineglass, projecting a look of calm, dangerous anticipation. We both knew the federal agents were already mobilizing. I remained perfectly seated for one more second, savoring the absolute certainty of their impending destruction. Then I turned to my right. A waiter stood frozen next to my chair, his eyes wide with second-hand embarrassment. I held out my half-empty crystal champagne flute. He blinked, clearly confused, before hesitantly extending his silver tray. I placed the glass down with a soft, deliberate clink. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored silk wedding gown. I did not look at the ground. I did not avert my gaze from the stage. I kept my head held high, my posture radiating total uncompromising confidence. The silence in the room intensified as my heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I walked at a steady, methodical pace directly toward the center stage. Every single step I took felt like a hammer striking the final nails into their corporate coffins. Bradley watched me approach, a triumphant, arrogant smirk slowly spreading across his face. He thought I was coming up to publicly surrender to him right there. Perfect. He thought I was coming up to publicly surrender to him right there. Perfect. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps to the elevated stage, moving with a calm and deliberate grace. My silk gown glided smoothly over the edge of the platform. Bradley extended his free hand toward me. His chest puffed out fully, expecting me to take his hand and bow my head in submission. I ignored his outstretched fingers completely. I stepped directly into his personal space, my eyes locked dead onto his. His arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by a sudden sharp flicker of uncertainty. He could see that my eyes were completely dry. There was no fear, no humiliation, and absolutely no submission. I reached out and firmly gripped the microphone he was holding. For a split second, he resisted, his knuckles turning white. But I gave him a look of such absolute chilling authority that his fingers instinctively loosened. I pulled the microphone smoothly from his grasp and turned to face the vast sea of wealthy guests. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the audio feedback from the speakers above. 200 faces stared back at me, their expressions frozen in a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. I held the microphone perfectly steady. My voice when I spoke rang out crystal clear and completely devoid of emotion. It was the precise clinical tone I used when dismantling hostile corporate executives in a federal deposition. What an incredibly generous son you are, Bradley. The words echoed off the vaulted ceilings. A wave of confused murmurs swept through the crowd. The wealthy investors in the front row exchanged bewildered glances. The groomsmen at the side table stopped their aggressive cheering, their champagne glasses hovering awkwardly in the air. This was not the script they had anticipated. They expected weeping, they expected begging, they expected me to flee. By standing my ground and complimenting him, I had completely derailed their carefully constructed narrative. Diane shifted uncomfortably beside Bradley. Her malicious sneer wavered. She narrowed her eyes, trying to decipher my angle. She leaned closer to the microphone, attempting to regain control of the situation. "You are making the right choice, Lauren," she said, her tone dripping with fake maternal condescension. "It is good to see you finally understand your place in this family." I turned my head slowly to look at her. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "Oh, I understand my place perfectly, Diane," I replied, my voice echoing loudly through the ballroom. "My place is exactly where I have always been, uncovering the truth." I turned my attention back to the bewildered crowd. I raised my chin, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the hall. Bradley has always loved to boast about his immense wealth and his brilliant real estate empire. I continued, my tone sharp and slicing through the tension. "He wants all of you to believe that transferring these 3 massive luxury estates to his mother is an act of pure, selfless devotion." I paused, letting the silence stretch tight across the room. I looked directly at Bradley. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down his temples. He took a half step backward, his predator instincts finally screaming that he had walked into a trap. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His vocal cords were paralyzed by a creeping, terrible realization. "And it is exceptionally brave of you to transfer those 3 estates to Diane right now," I announced, raising my voice to a commanding pitch, considering the Internal Revenue Service just placed a $4 million federal tax lien on all of them for massive investor fraud. The entire ballroom inhaled sharply as one collective entity. A woman in the front row gasped loudly, dropping her silver fork onto her china plate with a piercing clatter. The wealthy investors sat bolt upright, their faces draining of color as the words "investor fraud" echoed through the sound system. Panic rippled outward like electricity through water. I turned directly to my mother-in-law, who was now trembling visibly in her expensive silver gown. "Congratulations, Diane," I said, my voice ringing with brutal, triumphant clarity. "You are now the legal recipient of a $4 million federal debt and a prime suspect for felony money laundering." The silence shattered instantly. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Guests leaped out of their chairs. Bradley threw his hands out his face, turning an apoplectic shade of crimson. "Give me the mic," he bellowed, lunging toward me. "You are out of your mind. You are lying." I stepped back smoothly, keeping the microphone firmly in my grip. "I am a forensic accountant, Bradley," I stated, ensuring every single person in the room heard my actual profession. "Did you honestly think I spent my days balancing checkbooks? I have been tracking your offshore accounts for weeks. I know about the dummy corporations. I know about the fake cash revenues you funnel through Diane's boutique nail salons to wash your stolen capital. I downloaded your master ledger directly from your home office server 3 nights ago. You are running a massive Ponzi scheme, and you are completely bankrupt." Diane let out a high-pitched shriek. She grabbed Bradley's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging brutally into his tuxedo jacket. "Bradley, what is she talking about? What tax lien? Tell them she is lying. Tell them right now." He could not speak a single word to defend his actions. He was visibly hyperventilating, his wide eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit. The investors at the front tables were already pulling out their phones, shouting into their devices, demanding their wealth managers freeze their accounts immediately. The illusion of his success was burning to the ground right in front of his eyes, and there was absolutely nothing he could ever do. The ballroom had devolved into absolute pandemonium. Bradley, his face a ghostly shade of chalk white, finally lunged toward me, his hands outstretched in a blind, frantic grasp. He clawed at the air, his voice cracking into a desperate, high-pitched scream. "You cannot do this to me, Lauren. You are my wife. Under the laws of this state, you are legally on the hook for half of this debt. You are going down with me." The guests nearest to the stage scattered, tripping over their own feet to get away from the explosive rage of the man who had only moments ago been their hero. I did not retreat. I stood my ground, my posture firm and radiating a calm that seemed to drive Bradley even closer to the edge of sanity. I smiled brilliantly, a sharp, cold expression that didn't reach my eyes. "Actually, you are misinformed, Bradley," I said, letting the words hang in the air for maximum impact. "I made sure the marriage license was never filed. We exchanged vows in front of your friends, but the document never touched the desk of the county clerk. Legally, I am just a single woman attending a very expensive legally void party. I have zero liability for your Ponzi scheme or your tax fraud. You are utterly, completely, and permanently on your own." Bradley froze, his hands still trembling in the air. The realization that he had lost his human shield hit him harder than the threat of federal prison. He looked at me, then at the silent crowd, his entire body shaking with the force of his collapse. He had put all his eggs into a basket that I had systematically emptied months ago. I turned my head toward the back of the ballroom. Kendra stood up slowly from her table. She looked magnificent in her charcoal suit, her expression one of quiet, lethal focus. She raised her flute of champagne toward Diane, who was now clutching the edge of the stage, her knuckles white and her breathing shallow. Kendra's voice was smooth, deadly, and perfectly audible in the stunned room. "As a tax lawyer, I highly suggest you invoke your Fifth Amendment right, Diane. Every word you say right now is just adding years to your inevitable prison sentence." Before Diane could utter a single word of defense, the massive double doors at the main entrance burst open with a resounding crash. A dozen federal agents clad in tactical gear flooded into the ballroom. They moved with terrifying efficiency, forming a perimeter that sealed off the exits. They were not there for a negotiation. They were there to secure the premises and execute an arrest warrant. The crowd parted instinctively as the lead agent, a man with a stern face and an official badge hanging from his neck, marched directly toward the stage. Bradley swung around, his eyes darting toward the side exits, but the agents had already blocked them. He was trapped in his own glittering cage. The lead agent reached the base of the stage and gestured for his team to advance. "Bradley Davis, you are under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government," the agent declared, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers like a blade. I watched as the agents mounted the stage. Bradley did not even have the dignity to struggle. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The agents hauled him up, their movements efficient and emotionless. I heard the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for mercy, but I only looked away. I had no mercy left for a man who had tried to build his life on the ruins of mine. Diane was next. An agent approached her, reading her the same list of charges. She did not scream anymore. She simply looked aged, her perfectly highlighted hair seeming to lose its luster in the harsh, unflattering light of the ballroom. She was escorted out, her silver gown dragging through the spilled champagne on the floor. The guests watched in paralyzed horror as the man who had been entertaining them 10 minutes ago was hauled out in cuffs. The grand illusion was dead. The real estate empire, the wealth, the status, it had all been a hollow criminal spectacle. The lead agent stopped before me, nodding respectfully. "Ms. Carter, we received your anonymous tip. Everything we found matches your dossier exactly. You have been a significant help to this investigation." I tucked the silver pen into my clutch and nodded. "I am just glad the truth came out before more people were hurt," I replied. The agent signaled to his team, and they began securing the financial ledgers Bradley had left scattered on his office server. I looked across the room and saw Kendra standing by the stage, her arms folded over her chest. She was watching the agents work, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. We had done it. We had navigated the minefield of Bradley's malice and orchestrated the destruction of a fraud network that had victimized hundreds of innocent people. The guests, initially shocked into silence, began to murmur furiously. The news of the arrest was already hitting local digital outlets. I could see them frantically tapping on their phones, sharing the reality of their brilliant host's criminal downfall. The ballroom, once filled with manufactured adoration, was now a crime scene. Waiters stood frozen, holding trays that were no longer needed. The string quartet had long since vanished, their instruments abandoned in the corner. I walked off the stage feeling the heavy burden of the past few months finally dissolving into nothingness. I walked past the empty front tables, past the abandoned gifts, and toward the main exit. My path was clear, unencumbered by the dead weight of a husband who saw me as a liability, or a mother-in-law who saw me as an ATM. I pushed the heavy glass doors open, stepping out into the cool night air of the city. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sounds of the federal raid, continuing the shouting of agents, the heavy footsteps, the final dismantling of Bradley's empire. I walked toward my car, breathing in the scent of rain and freedom. I had come to this wedding to play a role, but I was leaving as the architect of my own liberation. The facade was gone, the truth had won, and I was finally truly and completely free. Section 21,000 words. Bradley looked utterly pathetic as the agents shoved him toward the main doors. His tailored tuxedo was rumpled, his silk tie hung loose like a noose, and he was screaming vile, incoherent obscenities that echoed off the high walls of the ballroom. He scrambled to find purchase on the polished floor, his polished shoes sliding as he desperately tried to pivot and face me. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a cornered rodent. Beside him, Diane had performed a spectacular collapse, clutching her chest and gasping for air with theatrical intensity. She waited for a rush of sympathy for some loyal relative to scoop her up and blame the harsh environment. But the paramedics the FBI had cleared to enter the building were not playing along. One of them knelt beside her, checked her pulse with a bored expression, and stood back up. "She is perfectly stable," the paramedic announced to the room. "She is just hyperventilating out of shock, not cardiac arrest." Her eyes snapped open, realizing the jig was up, and she was swiftly escorted out of the building by a pair of FBI agents, her silver gown dragging through the discarded champagne and shattered glass. The transition in the room was palpable. The remaining guests were no longer just observers. They were witnesses to a total moral disintegration. I looked over at the side table where Connor had been standing. He had finally seen the absolute depth of his brother's depravity and his mother's complicity. He did not move to help them. He did not offer a defense. Instead, he walked slowly across the dance floor, past the debris of his family's life, and stood firmly by Kendra's side. Kendra gripped his hand, her expression one of steely resolve. Connor looked at me and gave a short, sharp nod of respect. He had spent his life being the quiet sibling in the shadow of Bradley's ego, and today he chose truth over blood. 6 months moved with the speed of a freight train. The federal case against Bradley was remarkably swift because the evidence I had compiled was flawless. Without a legitimate marriage certificate, and with the vanishing ink on his power of attorney, he had absolutely no legal recourse. He was sentenced to a decade in federal prison, his name scrubbed from every real estate database, and his reputation permanently incinerated. Diane was not quite as fortunate as she had hoped. After the assets were frozen, she lost her boutique salons, her cars, and her social standing. The court ordered massive restitution, and she was forced to take a minimum wage position at a local discount warehouse stocking shelves under the flickering lights of the very store she used to look down on. It was a brutal fitting end for a woman who lived her entire life measuring people by their price tag. My own life, meanwhile, entered a period of extraordinary expansion. The Internal Revenue Service, recognizing the sheer scale of the fraud I had unmasked, awarded me a substantial whistleblower payout for my instrumental role in the investigation. It was a massive sum, but more importantly, it was a vindication of my professional identity. I took the capital, and along with Kendra decided to create something that would actually matter. We signed the lease on a prestigious office space in the heart of the city's financial district. It was not a cubicle. It was a partnership of equals built on transparency, integrity, and raw, unfiltered forensic expertise. Standing on the balcony of our new office on a clear Tuesday evening, the city lights sparkled like diamonds beneath us. I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, the same kind Bradley used to flaunt at his fake parties. But this time it tasted entirely different. It tasted like victory. Kendra stepped out onto the balcony, the city breeze catching her hair. She held her glass out and we clinked them together with a resonance that felt like the final closing note of a long, difficult symphony. We had not just survived, we had thrived. We had taken the wreckage of Bradley's malice and used it to build a firm that would set the standard for ethical financial investigation. I leaned against the cool metal railing, looking down at the street below. I thought about the woman who had stood in that bridal suite, feeling the suffocating pressure of a life she didn't want. I thought about the girl who believed her only value was in her credit score and her ability to be an invisible, supportive wife. That person was dead buried under the weight of Bradley's arrogance. In her place was a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she could do. I hadn't just escaped a scam, I had reclaimed my own narrative. The battle had been long, the costs had been high, and the emotional toll had been nearly unbearable at times, but I had made it to the other side. The view from the balcony was breathtaking, a sprawling panorama of the city I had spent years analyzing in the dark. Now I looked at it not as a puzzle to be solved for someone else's benefit, but as a terrain I had successfully conquered. I looked at Kendra, my partner, my sister, in everything that truly mattered, and I knew that no man, no family, and no fraud could ever make me feel small again. I stood tall, the cool night air refreshing against my skin, finally breathing the air of a woman who was truly, entirely her own master. I turned toward the camera which had been recording our celebratory toast. I wanted to leave one final message for the women watching this journey. I straightened my posture, my expression firm and empowered. Never ever let anyone make you feel small just because your skills aren't flashy or your life doesn't fit their narrow definition of success. If you are a number cruncher, a strategist, or a woman who values her own independence, never apologize for who you are. You do not exist to be a human shield for someone else's failures. You do not exist to absorb anyone's debt. Has a partner ever tried to exploit you financially or hide their true nature behind a facade of wealth? Please tell me your story in the comments below. We need to normalize talking about financial boundaries and spotting the warning signs before it is too late. Like this video, subscribe for more content on navigating toxic relationships and reclaiming your power. And remember that the best way to handle a predator is to simply outsmart them. Thank you for listening. This has been the most important lesson of my life.